The 7 biblical signs God is preparing you for an unexpected transition. Lately, something about your life may feel unfamiliar, not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. Certain conversations no longer affect you the same way. Certain environments feel emotionally distant. Certain goals that once consumed your energy now feel strangely empty. And perhaps the hardest part is this: you cannot fully explain why. From the outside, life may appear relatively normal. You continue fulfilling responsibilities. You continue showing up. You continue moving through daily routines the way you always have. But internally, something feels different. Almost as if your soul no longer fits comfortably inside the version of life you used to live. This feeling can be deeply unsettling, because transitions are difficult enough when they are visible. When there is a clear explanation, a clear ending, a clear beginning. But some of the most profound transitions happen internally, long before external circumstances change. And during those seasons, people often feel emotionally displaced without understanding what is happening to them. You begin feeling disconnected from things that once felt important. You lose emotional attachment to certain ambitions. You become quieter, more reflective, less emotionally reactive, less interested in superficial movement. And at first, many people interpret this as confusion. But sometimes it is not confusion. Sometimes God is slowly repositioning the soul before repositioning the life. Because before major spiritual transitions happen externally, they often begin internally. God starts changing what satisfies you, what drains you, what you tolerate, what you crave emotionally, what kind of life your spirit can no longer comfortably remain attached to. And this process can feel deeply uncomfortable, because transition often creates emotional tension before it creates clarity. Part of you senses that something is ending. Another part of you cannot yet see what is beginning. So you exist in between versions of yourself, no longer fully connected to the old season, but not yet fully established in the new one. That space can feel lonely, especially because other people may not understand what you are experiencing internally. They may think you are simply tired, distracted, overthinking. But inside, your soul feels like it is slowly shifting directions. And perhaps that is why certain things no longer bring the same emotional fulfillment they once did. Because God often prepares people for unexpected transitions by weakening their emotional dependence on the season they are about to outgrow, not to punish them, but to loosen the soul's attachment to what can no longer carry them where they are being led next. This process rarely feels exciting in the beginning. In fact, it often feels like emotional disorientation, because before new clarity emerges, old certainty usually begins fading first. And during that in-between season, many people quietly wonder, why do I feel so emotionally disconnected lately? Why does my old life no longer feel the same? Why do I feel internally restless even when nothing outwardly changed yet? But perhaps your soul is recognizing transition before your circumstances do. Perhaps God is preparing you emotionally before He changes things externally, because unexpected transitions rarely begin with visible movement. They usually begin with invisible transformation, and maybe that invisible transformation is already happening inside you now. One of the first signs that God is preparing you for an unexpected transition is that your current life begins feeling emotionally unfamiliar, even before anything outwardly changes. This is often confusing because externally, everything may still appear the same. Your routines remain. Your responsibilities continue. The people around you may not notice anything different at all. But internally, something no longer feels fully aligned. Places that once energized you now leave you emotionally tired. Goals that once motivated you intensely begin losing emotional weight. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel strangely empty. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that you cannot fully explain, whooshy, this is happening. You are not necessarily unhappy. You are not necessarily angry. You simply feel disconnected from a version of life that once felt emotionally natural to you. This kind of transition can feel deeply lonely because it creates internal tension before external clarity appears. Part of you still tries to function normally, still tries to maintain the same rhythm, still tries to reconnect emotionally with what once satisfied you. But another part of you quietly recognizes that something inside has already started changing. And when people do not understand this process, they often fight it. They force themselves to stay emotionally attached to seasons their soul has already begun outgrowing. They try to recreate old excitement, old motivation, old emotional responses. But spiritual transitions rarely allow a person to remain emotionally comfortable inside old versions of themselves forever. Because before God moves someone into a new season, He often begins by changing their internal relationship with the current one, not through sudden rejection, but through gradual emotional detachment. This detachment is important because human beings naturally cling to familiarity. Even unhealthy familiarity can feel emotionally safer than uncertainty. That is why many people remain attached to environments, identities, and routines long after their spirit has stopped growing there. Not because they are weak, but because transition creates vulnerability. And vulnerability often feels frightening before it feels freeing. So God slowly begins loosening the soul's emotional dependence on what can no longer carry its future growth. At first, this process may simply feel like emotional fatigue. You lose excitement for things that once consumed your attention. You become less emotionally invested in superficial goals. You stop feeling fulfilled by constant activity alone. And eventually, you begin noticing something deeper. Your spirit is craving meaning more than stimulation. That realization changes everything internally, because once the soul begins searching for deeper alignment, many external structures stop feeling emotionally sustainable. You begin recognizing how much of your life may have been built around habit instead of purpose, routine instead of peace, expectation instead of genuine inner conviction. And this awareness creates discomfort, not because God is destroying your life, but because He is preparing your heart to stop depending emotionally on things that no longer reflect who you are becoming. This is one reason transitions often begin with internal restlessness. Your soul starts recognizing misalignment before your mind fully understands it. And during this process, people frequently feel guilty for changing emotionally. You may wonder, why don't I feel connected to this anymore? Why does everything suddenly feel different? Why can't I force myself to care the same way I used to? But perhaps your spirit is not becoming unstable. Perhaps it is becoming ready. Ready for a new level of emotional maturity. Ready for a different kind of life. Ready for deeper alignment with who God is shaping you to become. Because unexpected transitions rarely start with external movement first. They begin when the soul quietly realizes it can no longer fully live inside the emotional reality of its old season. And maybe that explains why your inner world feels so different lately. Maybe God is not removing your peace. Maybe He is gently removing your attachment to what can no longer carry your future. One of the most painful signs that God is preparing you for an unexpected transition is that certain relationships begin feeling emotionally different, even if nothing dramatic happened outwardly. At first, the change is subtle. Conversations that once felt effortless now feel strangely heavy. Certain interactions leave you emotionally drained instead of connected. You begin sensing distance in places where you once felt emotional familiarity. And what makes this especially difficult is that there may not be a clear reason for it. No betrayal, no visible conflict, no obvious separation, just a quiet internal awareness that something no longer fits the same way it once did. This can create deep emotional confusion because human beings naturally attach meaning to relational stability. We expect important connections to remain emotionally constant. We assume that if relationships matter deeply, they should continue feeling the same indefinitely. But spiritual transitions often change people internally before they change relationships externally. As your inner world shifts, your emotional alignment with certain people also begins shifting. Not always because someone is wrong, not always because the relationship was unhealthy. Sometimes two people simply stop growing in the same direction emotionally and spiritually. And that realization can feel heartbreaking, especially when you genuinely care about the people involved. Truthfully, many emotionally mature adults carry grief over relationships that slowly faded without clear explanation. Not because love completely disappeared, but because alignment quietly changed. One person keeps evolving internally, while the other remains emotionally connected to an older version of them. And eventually, interactions start feeling strained in ways neither person fully knows how to explain. This is one reason transitions can feel so lonely. You are not only grieving external change, you are grieving emotional familiarity, the comfort of being understood easily, the comfort of belonging naturally, the comfort of feeling emotionally synchronized with people who once felt deeply connected to your life. But when God prepares someone for transition, He often changes their emotional tolerance first. You begin craving deeper honesty, deeper peace, deeper intentionality, and environments or relationships built around older emotional patterns may no longer nourish your spirit the same way. This does not automatically mean you must abandon people. Spiritually mature transitions are not built on arrogance or emotional superiority. In fact, one of the dangers during seasons of transition is becoming prideful about personal growth. That is not what God desires. But He does sometimes allow emotional misalignment to expose where your soul can no longer continue shrinking itself just to preserve familiarity. That realization is painful, because many people spend years maintaining relationships by suppressing parts of themselves internally. They stay emotionally attached to versions of life that no longer reflect who they are becoming, simply because they fear loneliness, conflict, or change. But eventually, the soul becomes exhausted from pretending alignment still exists where it has quietly faded. And during transition seasons, this emotional exhaustion intensifies. You may find yourself becoming quieter around certain people, more inward, less emotionally expressive. Not because you stopped caring, but because your spirit no longer feels fully at home inside dynamics that once felt natural. This creates a difficult emotional tension. Part of you wants to hold on to the old connection. Another part recognizes that forcing emotional alignment rarely restores genuine peace. And perhaps this is one reason God allows certain relationships to feel uncomfortable during transition seasons. Not always to remove people from your life, but to reveal where your emotional identity has already started changing. Because some relationships are connected to who you were, not necessarily who you are becoming. And unexpected transitions often require the soul to release emotional dependence on old forms of belonging before new alignment fully appears. That process feels vulnerable. It can make you question yourself, question your emotions, question whether you are becoming distant or overly sensitive. But maybe what you are experiencing is not emotional coldness. Maybe your soul is slowly recognizing that the life God is leading you toward cannot be built entirely on relationships rooted in an older version of yourself. And perhaps that is why certain connections now feel different. Not because love became impossible, but because transition quietly changes the emotional language of the soul long before the future becomes visible. One of the clearest signs that God is preparing you for an unexpected transition is that your inner world begins craving stillness more than stimulation. This shift can feel unusual at first, especially if you once depended on constant movement to feel emotionally grounded. You used to stay busy naturally, focused, mentally occupied, always moving towards something. But lately, something inside you has slowed down. Not laziness, not emotional collapse, something deeper. You begin feeling emotionally overwhelmed by constant noise. Certain environments feel overstimulating. Endless activity no longer creates the same satisfaction it once did. And instead of craving more distraction, your soul begins longing for quiet. Not only physical quiet, internal quiet. You feel drawn toward reflection, toward solitude, toward moments where you can finally hear your own thoughts without the pressure of constant external demands. At first, many people resist this transition because modern life teaches people to interpret stillness as unproductive. If you are not constantly achieving, moving, reacting, producing, or consuming, it can feel like something is wrong. But spiritually, some of the deepest transitions begin when God starts separating the soul from constant emotional overstimulation, because noise often keeps people disconnected from themselves. Activity becomes avoidance. Distraction becomes emotional escape. Constant busyness prevents deeper reflection from surfacing, and eventually the soul becomes exhausted from never truly slowing down internally. That exhaustion is important, because many people only discover what is happening inside them once external noise begins losing its emotional grip. And during transition seasons, God often allows this internal slowing to happen intentionally, not to isolate you from life, but to prepare your spirit for deeper clarity. Because clarity rarely grows in emotional chaos, it grows in stillness. That is why many spiritually mature people become quieter before major transitions, not because they are becoming emotionally detached from reality, but because their soul is trying to process deeper internal movement. You begin reflecting differently, observing more, reacting less impulsively. Things that once consumed your emotional energy no longer feel as important. You become more selective with where your attention goes. You stop feeling emotionally nourished by endless stimulation alone. And this shift can feel disorienting if you do not understand what is happening. Part of you may worry, why don't I feel motivated the same way anymore? Why do I suddenly need more space? Why does constant activity feel emotionally draining now? But perhaps your soul is not shutting down. Perhaps it is repositioning itself. Because before God moves a person externally, He often creates internal space first. Space to reflect, space to detach emotionally from old pressures, space to recognize what truly matters beneath the noise of constant survival mode. And this process changes priorities profoundly. You begin valuing peace more than pressure, meaning more than performance, depth more than stimulation. That does not mean you stop caring about responsibilities. Spiritually mature stillness is not irresponsibility. It is alignment. Your soul starts resisting activity that only keeps you emotionally distracted without truly nourishing your inner life. And eventually, you realize something important. Much of your previous exhaustion may not have come only from hard circumstances. It came from living in a state of constant emotional overstimulation for too long. Always reacting, always rushing, always consuming, always trying to mentally stay ahead of life. But transition seasons often slow people internally before they redirect them externally. And that slowing can feel uncomfortable because it removes emotional momentum before new clarity fully arrives. This is why many people feel temporarily in between during spiritual transitions. The old rhythm no longer fits. The new direction is not fully visible yet. So the soul enters a quieter season, a reflective season, A season where God gradually teaches the heart how to stop depending on constant movement, to feel emotionally secure. And perhaps that is why silence feels different to you lately. Maybe God is not taking your passion away. Maybe He is calming the noise around your soul so you can finally recognize where He is leading you next. One of the most difficult signs that God is preparing you for an unexpected transition is when certain areas of your life begin slowing down despite all your efforts to keep them moving. This can feel incredibly frustrating emotionally, especially if you are someone who has always carried responsibility seriously, someone who plans carefully, works hard, tries to stay disciplined, tries to keep life stable through effort and consistency. Because when you are that kind of person, slowing down can feel threatening. It can feel like failure, like loss of momentum, like life is slipping out of your control. But spiritual transitions often begin with disruption to emotional dependency on control. There are seasons where God allows things to stop progressing at the speed you expected. Doors remain unclear, plans lose momentum, certainty fades, timelines shift, and internally, this creates tension. Part of you keeps trying to force clarity, force movement, force certainty, but another part of you quietly feels exhausted from carrying the pressure of trying to manage everything emotionally. This is one reason transition seasons feel so disorienting. You're not only losing external momentum, you are losing internal certainty about how life is supposed to unfold. And for many emotionally mature adults, certainty became part of emotional survival. If they could plan effectively, they felt safer. If they could predict outcomes, they felt calmer. If they stayed mentally ahead of life, they believed they could prevent unnecessary pain. But eventually, God allows slowing seasons to expose something deeper. The soul was never meant to build peace entirely on control, because control creates temporary emotional reassurance, but not lasting inner stability. And this realization becomes unavoidable when life stops responding to your usual methods. You try harder, think more, plan more carefully, yet internally, peace still feels distant. Why? Because God is not only changing your circumstances during transition seasons, He is changing your relationship with dependence itself. You begin realizing how much emotional pressure you carried trying to hold everything together constantly. How difficult it became to rest internally without visible certainty. How exhausting it felt to emotionally manage every possible outcome before it even happened. And slowly, God begins loosening that burden, not by making you irresponsible, but by teaching your soul that not every transition can be controlled into existence. Some seasons require surrender before direction appears. That is difficult for emotionally strong people to accept, because responsible people often feel guilty when life slows down. They assume they are not doing enough, not trying hard enough, not fixing things fast enough. But sometimes slowing seasons are not evidence of failure. Sometimes they are evidence that God is interrupting patterns of emotional dependence your soul can no longer sustain. And this interruption changes you internally. You begin becoming less frantic emotionally, less desperate to force answers immediately, less controlled by the fear of falling behind. Not because uncertainty becomes easy, but because exhaustion eventually reveals something important. Constant pressure was never creating true peace. It was only creating emotional survival mode. And perhaps for the first time in years, your soul is beginning to realize how tired it actually became from carrying the weight of trying to control everything all the time. That realization is painful, but also deeply healing. Because once the soul stops building identity around constant productivity, movement, and emotional control, space begins opening for something deeper. Trust. Not passive resignation, not avoidance, but a quieter trust that understands life cannot always be forced into clarity before its time. And maybe that is why certain things feel delayed right now. Maybe God is not withholding your future. Maybe He is slowing down the parts of your life that depended too heavily on control, so your soul can survive the transition with deeper peace. Because unexpected transitions rarely begin with external certainty. They often begin when God gently teaches the heart how to remain steady even while the old rhythm of life is no longer working the same way anymore. One of the most emotionally unsettling signs that God is preparing you for an unexpected transition is that you begin feeling disconnected from the identity you once depended on to understand yourself. This process can feel deeply disorienting because identity gives people emotional stability. It tells you who you are, how you fit into the world, what gives your life meaning, what role you believe you are supposed to play. And for many people, identity becomes tightly connected to performance, responsibilities, relationships, achievements, routines, or emotional roles they have carried for years. You become the strong one, the dependable one, the provider, the caretaker, the responsible one, the person who always knows what to do. And over time, those roles stop feeling like things you do. They become who you believe you are. But spiritual transitions often begin when God starts loosening your emotional attachment to identities that can no longer carry your next season. This does not happen suddenly. At first, you may simply notice internal emptiness around things that once defined you strongly. The role still exists externally, but internally it no longer feels fully alive. You continue functioning, continue fulfilling obligations, continue showing up the way you always have. But something inside no longer feels completely connected to the identity you spent years building, and that realization can create fear. Because when identity begins shifting, people often feel emotionally ungrounded. You start wondering, if I am no longer this version of myself, then who am I becoming? If the things that once defined me no longer satisfy me emotionally, what happens now? Why do I suddenly feel disconnected from the person I used to be? These questions are painful because identity transitions create temporary emotional instability before deeper alignment emerges. Part of you still clings to the familiar version of yourself, the version people recognize, the version that once gave you certainty and structure. But another part of you quietly senses that your soul has already started changing. And this tension becomes exhausting. Especially because many people build their entire emotional security around being needed, productive, capable, or emotionally dependable for others. So when God begins dismantling emotional dependence on those identities, the soul often feels vulnerable for the first time in years, not weak, exposed. Because underneath many strong identities lies a hidden fear. If I stop being this version of myself, will I still have value? That fear runs deeper than most people realize. Some people do not know who they are outside of responsibility, outside of productivity, outside of being emotionally useful to everyone around them. But transition seasons force the soul to confront deeper questions about identity, questions that performance alone cannot answer. And while this process feels uncomfortable, it is often deeply necessary, because God cannot fully establish new spiritual alignment inside a person who is still emotionally imprisoned by an outdated version of themselves. Sometimes the old identity was built around survival, around fear, around proving worth, around emotional protection, and while those identities may have helped you endure previous seasons, they cannot always sustain the future God is preparing you for. That is why transition seasons often feel like internal unraveling before they feel like clarity. The old identity weakens first. The new identity has not fully formed yet, so the soul exists in unfamiliar territory, no longer fully connected to who it used to be, but not yet fully secure in who it is becoming. This season requires enormous emotional patience because many people panic when old identity structures begin collapsing internally. They try to force themselves back into old versions of life simply because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. But eventually, the soul becomes too honest to keep pretending. You realize you cannot continue building your entire identity around roles that no longer reflect your deeper spiritual growth. And perhaps that is why you feel emotionally different lately. Maybe God is not removing your identity. Maybe He is separating your worth from identities that were never meant to carry the full weight of your soul forever. Because unexpected transitions often begin when God lovingly dismantles the version of yourself that can no longer accompany you into the life ahead. One of the strangest parts of spiritual transition is that externally, the future may still feel uncertain. Yet internally, something deeper begins stabilizing. This can feel contradictory at first, because normally people expect peace to come after clarity, after answers, after visible direction finally appears. But during certain seasons, God allows maturity to develop before certainty arrives. So even while questions remain unanswered, your inner world slowly starts changing. You notice yourself reacting differently, thinking differently, carrying uncertainty differently. Not perfectly, not without difficult moments, but there is less emotional panic than before. And this is important because emotionally exhausted people often measure stability through external predictability. If life feels organized, they feel secure. If the future feels visible, they feel calm. If plans are unfolding correctly, they feel emotionally grounded. But transition seasons disrupt that dependency. The old certainty disappears first. The new direction has not fully appeared yet. And in that space, God begins teaching the soul something deeper than control: internal steadiness. This steadiness develops quietly. You begin tolerating uncertainty without immediately emotionally collapsing. You stop needing immediate answers for every unresolved situation. You become slower before reacting impulsively to fear. And while externally you may still feel in transition, internally your soul is becoming stronger in ways you do not immediately recognize. This is often how spiritual maturity develops. Not through dramatic emotional experiences, but through prolonged seasons, where a person learns how to remain emotionally grounded while clarity remains incomplete. And this kind of maturity changes people profoundly, because before, uncertainty automatically created internal alarm. The unknown felt emotionally threatening, silence felt dangerous. But now something is shifting. You still have questions, you still carry concerns, you still wish certain things were clearer. Yet your soul is no longer reacting with the same desperation to control the future immediately. That change matters deeply, because it means your emotional stability is slowly becoming less dependent on external certainty. And perhaps for the first time in years, your inner peace is beginning to grow independently from visible outcomes. This transformation is subtle, but powerful. You begin understanding that maturity is not the absence of uncertainty. Maturity is the growing ability to remain internally steady while uncertainty still exists. That realization changes how you move through life. You become less emotionally reactive to temporary confusion, less controlled by fear-based urgency, less dependent on immediate reassurance to remain grounded. And this often surprises people around you, because externally, your life may still look unresolved, but internally, something calmer is emerging. Not passivity, not emotional numbness, wisdom. The kind of wisdom that only develops when a person survives enough difficult seasons to realize that panic never truly protected the soul. And perhaps that is why transition seasons often feel slower than people expect. Because God is not only preparing your circumstances, He is preparing your inner capacity to carry what comes next without losing yourself emotionally inside it. That preparation requires maturity. It requires emotional endurance, patience, discernment, the ability to tolerate temporary ambiguity without abandoning peace entirely. And these things rarely grow during easy seasons. They usually grow quietly during periods where life remains partially unclear. That is why many people misinterpret transition seasons. They assume uncertainty means failure, but sometimes uncertainty is simply the environment where deeper stability is being formed. And maybe that is exactly what has been happening inside you lately. Maybe the future still feels unclear because God is focusing first on strengthening the part of you that will eventually walk into it. Because unexpected transitions are not only about arriving somewhere new externally, they are about becoming someone emotionally capable of carrying the new season with wisdom, steadiness, and peace once it finally arrives. One of the final signs that God is preparing you for an unexpected transition is that you slowly begin understanding something your exhausted heart struggled to believe for a long time. This season is not necessarily destruction, it is repositioning. At first, transition often feels like loss of certainty, loss of emotional familiarity, loss of old rhythms, loss of connection to the version of life that once felt stable. And because human beings naturally fear instability, the mind immediately searches for explanations. Why does everything feel so different? Why do I feel emotionally disconnected? Why does life feel uncertain even when I'm trying my best? During these seasons, many people quietly assume something must be wrong with their decisions, wrong with their spiritual life, wrong with their future. But over time, deeper clarity begins emerging. You start realizing that God was not removing peace from your life. He was removing attachment to things your soul could no longer remain rooted in. That distinction changes everything internally. Because spiritually mature transitions are rarely about punishment. They're about preparation. God begins loosening emotional dependence on identities, environments, relationships, expectations, and patterns that once supported you but can no longer sustain your future growth. And this process feels painful precisely because the soul naturally resists unfamiliarity. Even when old seasons stop nourishing us emotionally, familiarity still feels safer than uncertainty. That is why transition often creates grief before it creates freedom. You grieve old versions of yourself, old dreams, old emotional attachments, old ways of understanding life. And during that grieving process, it can feel as though everything stable is disappearing. But slowly, your perception changes. You begin recognizing that God was not dismantling your life randomly. He was repositioning your soul for deeper alignment. This realization creates profound emotional relief because many emotionally exhausted people spend transition seasons fighting internally against what God is actually trying to prepare them for. They cling to expired identities, expired rhythms, expired expectations, not because they are weak, but because the unknown feels vulnerable. Yet eventually, the soul becomes too tired to keep forcing itself back into seasons it has already spiritually outgrown. And once that happens, surrender begins replacing resistance. Not passive surrender, peaceful surrender. You stop demanding immediate explanations for every emotional shift. You stop interpreting uncertainty as automatic evidence of failure. You stop believing that unfamiliarity always means something is going wrong. Instead, you begin recognizing something spiritually mature people eventually learn. Sometimes God destabilizes old emotional foundations because He is preparing the soul to live differently, with deeper wisdom, deeper peace, deeper honesty, deeper alignment. And this transformation changes the way you experience the future itself. The unknown no longer feels only threatening. It begins feeling possible, not because you suddenly have all the answers, but because your soul is no longer completely terrified of transition. You realize that some endings are necessary, some detachments are healthy, some seasons must close emotionally before new growth can fully emerge. And perhaps for the first time, you stop trying to emotionally resurrect the version of life your spirit already knows it has outgrown. That is a major spiritual turning point, because healing often begins when the soul stops resisting the transition God has already started internally. And maybe that is what this season has truly been about all along. Not the destruction of your life, but the quiet repositioning of your soul. A repositioning that is teaching you how to let go of old emotional dependence, how to survive uncertainty without collapsing internally, how to trust God even before the future fully makes sense. And perhaps one day you will look back at this season differently, not as the season where your life fell apart, but as the season where your soul finally began moving toward deeper alignment with who you were becoming all along. Perhaps this is why life has felt so emotionally unfamiliar lately, not because you are losing yourself, but because the version of you that once fit your old season can no longer fully carry where God is leading you next. And that realization is not easy, because transitions rarely begin with clarity. They begin with discomfort, with internal restlessness, with emotional detachment from things that once felt meaningful, with the strange feeling that your soul no longer fully belongs inside the life it used to know. That experience can feel deeply lonely, especially when nothing dramatic has happened outwardly, when other people still expect you to remain the same, when you yourself cannot fully explain why your inner world feels so different now. But perhaps this season is not evidence that your life is falling apart. Perhaps it is evidence that your soul is evolving beyond what once emotionally defined it, because before God changes a person's direction externally, He often changes their attachment internally. He loosens emotional dependence on old rhythms, old identities, old relationships, old versions of success, old forms of security, not to leave the soul empty, but to create space for deeper alignment. And yes, that process can feel painful, because human beings naturally grieve familiarity. Even when old seasons no longer nourish us emotionally, part of us still misses the comfort of knowing who we were, where we belonged, and how life was supposed to feel. But spiritually mature transitions require something difficult: the willingness to let the soul outgrow what once felt emotionally safe. And perhaps that is the deeper work happening inside you right now. Maybe God is teaching you how to stop clinging to versions of life your spirit already knows it can no longer fully inhabit. Maybe He is teaching you how to survive uncertainty without immediately interpreting it as failure. Maybe He is showing you that emotional discomfort is not always destruction. Sometimes it is preparation for greater maturity, greater peace, greater alignment, greater honesty with yourself and with Him. Because unexpected transitions are not only about where you are going, they are about who you are becoming while getting there. And perhaps that is why this season feels slower, quieter, and more emotionally reflective than others. God is not only rearranging external circumstances, He is strengthening your inner foundation, teaching your soul how to remain steady without constant certainty, teaching your heart how to release old emotional attachments with grace, teaching you how to trust Him even while clarity remains incomplete. And maybe one day you will understand why this season had to feel uncomfortable first, because some transformations cannot happen while a person is still emotionally attached to the life they are being prepared to leave behind. That does not mean your past was meaningless. Every previous season carried lessons, growth, survival, wisdom. But not every season was meant to become your permanent home emotionally. And perhaps your soul already senses that now. Perhaps that is why certain environments no longer satisfy you, why certain relationships feel different, why silence has become more meaningful, why your inner world keeps pulling you toward reflection, stillness, and deeper emotional honesty. Maybe God is not removing peace from your life. Maybe He is guiding you toward a version of peace that no longer depends on remaining emotionally attached to what you have already outgrown. If this message spoke to your current season, write in the comments, "I trust God through this transition." And wherever you are emotionally right now, may God give you peace inside uncertainty, wisdom inside change, patience during the waiting, and the quiet confidence to trust that even when life feels unfamiliar, your soul is not being abandoned. It is being prepared.